Welcome back to The Real Story with Jeanne Ives. In studio with me today is Steve Gorham. He is a friend of the show. You've heard him before on my podcast, and in his expertise is energy, everything energy. And we're going to talk about specifically the Supreme Court decision that put the brakes on the EPA in a far-reaching decision. That headline comes straight from the Wall Street Journal. The High Court says the agency, the EPA, overstepped its authority in restricting greenhouse gas emissions in a ruling with ramifications for other regulators. So Steve Gorham, just a little bit more about you so our audience understands that we're talking with a real expert here. He's a speaker, an author, and a researcher on energy, industry, and environmental issues, and an independent columnist. He's the executive director of the Climate Science Coalition of America and advisor to the Heartland Institute. He is the author of 3 books, including Outside the Green Box, Rethinking Sustainable Development. More than 100,000 copies of his book are now in print. Steve holds a BS and an MS in electrical engineering from our own University of Illinois and an MBA from the University of Chicago. He has more than 30 years of experience in Fortune 100 and private companies in engineering and executive roles. Steve, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Jeannie. Great to join you again.
Yes. So we specifically were having you on in the wake of the Supreme Court decision, which essentially, can you explain a little bit more about that decision? It deals entirely with the EPA's role in shutting down coal. And of course, it was brought by West Virginia coal companies. Right. And it was a response to them over-regulating from a perspective of just the agency making decisions rather than legislators making decisions. Yes. So I'm interested in that aspect as we have a more regulatory environment overall, whether it's at the state, the local, or the federal level. You find it everywhere where they're letting just agencies make decisions. But could you also speak to the aspect specifically of what this means for coal going forward?
Right. So the EPA's power to regulate air emissions comes from the Clean Air Act of 1977, revised 1990, and then a little bit beyond that, where Congress gave EPA the power to limit emissions of, I think they listed about 50 or 60 items in that act. Carbon dioxide, by the way, was not one of those.
Wow.
And then in 2015, under the Obama administration, the EPA came out with a Clean Power Plan, which aimed to get utilities and states to reduce emissions from power plants by 32% by 2030. The Supreme Court actually stayed that effort at that regulation in 2016. And then when Trump came in, his EPA said that the EPA had overstepped their bounds. But I think West Virginia was afraid that EPA was going to come back and try and reinstitute something like that, which would have cost billions of dollars to the utilities. And it was and what the Supreme Court was talking about was what they called a generation shifting effect. That was actually what EPA called it, generation shifting. And the court said that Congress did not grant EPA the authority to do generation shifting, and said it was going to cost billions of dollars. And so they said this is up to Congress to step in and clarify what they want to do, and that the EPA doesn't have the power to do this sort of generation shifting. And as a matter of fact, cap and trade, which they have in Europe for carbon dioxide emissions trading, has been defeated 5 times in the United States over the last 3 decades by the Congress. Either it wasn't brought because they didn't have the votes, or it was actually voted down. And so it's clear Congress doesn't want to go that far, but nevertheless the EPA has tried to do that with the Clean Power Plan, and the Obama administration, or the Biden administration, was attempting to go do that again. At least that was West Virginia's fear.
Well, the Wall Street Journal wrote specifically about the decision. They pulled a quote from the Chief Justice wrote. And, of course, Chief Justice Roberts wrote this decision, which is phenomenal. And he wrote, "A decision of such magnitude and consequence rests with Congress itself or an agency acting pursuant to a clear delegation from that representative body. The vague language of a long extant but rarely used statute is what the EPA was doing in finding new powers. So they went way beyond what they were required to do as an agency. And when you talk about this, And I think it's funny because you kind of like glossed over this comment, but it's true. The EPA was set up and they were set to limit emissions on 50 different pollutants.
Right.
And then you just, as a off the cuff remark, said one of those is not CO2.
Right.
But carbon dioxide is basically what this hysteria is all about.
Yeah, it is.
So can you talk more about that? Because this idea that limiting carbon dioxide is the holy grail when we've already been able to scrub off many of the other pollutants that are created from producing energy. What's going on here?
Right. Well, there's been an industry that has grown up that talks about limiting carbon dioxide, and actually a suit was brought in 2007, I believe, by Massachusetts and some other states versus the EPA. And the court then ruled, the Supreme Court, that the EPA had to make a decision. They had to either decide one way or the other on carbon dioxide. And so the Obama's EPA, on December 7, 2009, a date that will live in infamy, not in memory of Pearl Harbor, but on that date, the EPA ruled the so-called endangerment finding, that greenhouse gases were endangering the health and safety of U.S. citizens. And so that has really been the basis of things and eventually led to the Clean Power Plan. But now the new Supreme Court has say, well, wait a minute, you can't go as far as you're going. You have to go back to Congress to get specifics. There's also a doctrine called the Major Questions Doctrine that the current court holds to. And it basically says if this question is major, you have to go back to Congress to get it done. And that's pretty much what they ruled. And it was interesting that it was a 6-3 ruling with Chief Justice Roberts joining the conservative group to turn this over. But as you know, there have been all kinds of statements now about how terrible this is. President Biden first said this decision risks damaging our nation's ability to keep our air clean and combat climate change.
Yep.
Senator Elizabeth Warren said the planet is on fire and this extremist Supreme Court has destroyed the federal government's ability to fight back. And then we have Representative Raul Grijalva, Democrat of Arizona. The Supreme Court had, quote, sentenced our planet to death. All these things, all these wild statements. This whole idea, though, that Biden says keep our air clean and combat climate change. There's always a conflict. There's a conflation, I should say, clean air and carbon dioxide, which is incorrect. Mm-hmm. We breathe in only a trace of CO2, only 4 molecules in every 10,000 in the atmospheric carbon dioxide, just a little bit. But every minute we're burning sugar in our body, and then so we exhale 100 times what's in the atmosphere with every breath. We all exhale carbon dioxide. It's not a pollutant. It doesn't harm anything. It's great for plants. Sometimes I put up a chart that shows the world's top 7 food crops all growing bigger with higher levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide. It's if there's one compound we could put into the biosphere, that's great for the biosphere, carbon dioxide is that compound.
Well, and what's interesting, if you're growing marijuana in some sort of like greenhouse.
Yes, ma'am.
What are you pumping in? You're pumping in carbon dioxide to make those plants grow bigger and faster.
Yeah, I always ask that to audiences, and I love to put up images of they got a tank of CO2 right here, and they got something else over here.
Absolutely.
So it's really been kind of crazy, and it's because of this obsession of global warming, the greenhouse effect, and other things that people say we have to get rid of all carbon dioxide. The world is spending over $500 billion a year to try and do that, and it's really a shame. Every dollar that we spend on carbon capture and all these other foolish things is not money that could go toward getting clean water for people around the world, food, and bettering the standard of living of people around the world.
That's far more important to people's health is clean water, and yet we have 400,000 lead pipes in the state of Illinois that Lori Lightfoot has recently said will take 50 years to correct, and it's going to be, I think it's a $15 billion project. But I think clean water is far more important at this point than CO2, which is actually beneficial for plant growth. Not to mention, there's so much more we could talk about this. I love this one. This is Eric Milito, writing in Real Clear Energy. This is from June 26, 2022. Chasing utopian energy, how I wasted 20 years of my life. And he basically admits, I wasted 20 years of my life chasing utopian energy. Utopian energy is an imagined form of energy that's abundant, reliable, inexpensive, and also clean, renewable, and life-sustaining. But utopian energy is as much a fantasy as utopian society. And, he goes on and on to basically admit, and I wish there were a lot more people who would admit, that they basically, bought into a lot of climate hysteria that just isn't actually essential. He goes, I used to think solar and wind power were the best ways to reduce CO2 emissions, but the biggest reduction in CO2 emissions during the last 15 years, over 60%, has come from switching from coal to natural gas.
Bingo. That's right on the nose.
And now, in the wake of an energy crisis, we actually should be working on more coal energy rather than shutting it down, which we're doing in the state of Illinois. And now you've got Ameren essentially saying, look, you have signaled to the coal that they're not welcome anymore. So guess what? They're not investing anymore in their plants. Yeah. And those plants need investment every single day. Maintenance needs to be done. And since you intend to shut them down and say we're not going to have any more fossil fuels by 2050, which is ridiculous, not doable, can't run a modern economy or even any semblance of it. Can't charge your cell phone, sorry, with the windmills that aren't blowing. So when the wind's not blowing. You're signaling to these people, so they've already decided to shut down coal by themselves because you told them they're not going to shut down. And Ameren puts out a warning: expect higher prices and rolling blackouts in central and southern Illinois.
We'll have to talk about some of that. A little history, though. The point about natural gas is very important. People don't remember, most of the young people, that people used to do spring cleaning every spring in the 1950s and 60s. My grandfather had a coal furnace, and he had a coal bin. A big truck used to come up and dump coal down into his coal bin in the basement. But people would do spring cleaning because and it would snow in Chicago, and in 5 days they would have coal dust, on all the snow. The snow would be black, and people did spring cleaning in the spring. They actually would wash walls to take the coal dust off walls. But natural gas has changed all of that. Natural gas came in, it made our air very, very much cleaner. And even today, there are still 70 million homes in Europe that are burning wood for fuel. If they replace those with natural gas, the particulate levels would go down by a factor of 1,000 in a home from burning gas and other things. By the way, coal, now we put scrubbers on plants, so we get rid of all that sort of stuff, and it's very much better. Our air pollutants are down 80% since 1980. But again, that's not counting carbon dioxide. We got to make sure that we don't get involved in that.
So I mean,
that
there's
misconception.
When you're talking about energy as a whole, I think that people they're confused to some degree. So we think about we should have electric vehicles instead of having oil-based automotives.
Yep.
But those electric vehicles are going to be powered by what in the future?
Whatever's in the electrical power supply, of course.
Right.
Today, that's still 60% of the world is hydrocarbons. In the U.S., the current numbers are, I think it's about 20% coal, 40% natural gas, 20% nuclear, and there's about 10 or 11% is wind and solar currently. So it's a pretty good mix of hydrocarbons still. We're running about 60% like the rest of the world. But the other thing about electric vehicles is they require a lot of hydrocarbons to produce. To produce those batteries requires a huge amount of emissions. When you first get an electric car, you've emitted a lot more carbon dioxide emissions for what it's worth. Again, not shouldn't be a big deal than an internal combustion engine car, and it isn't until you've driven 100,000 miles that you may catch up. One of the problems with the wind industry right now is the price of steel has gone way up with this world energy crisis, and they put so much steel in their wind turbines, they can't make any money anymore with the price of steel.
And they produce that steel using hydrocarbons.
That's right. They use coke, and they use natural gas for heating, coal and natural gas. The steel industry, 1.6 billion tons of steel a year, and they use vast amounts of hydrocarbons. So we really can't get away from those. It would be decades and decades and decades. And again, when the world wakes up and realizes that carbon dioxide isn't such a big problem, maybe a lot of this will go away. We'll see.
Well, I think that's the crux of the problem. So could you talk to us a little bit about that? I mean, so this whole hysteria surrounding CO2
Right.
and rising seas that they say
Right.
is occurring. I mean, these are things that in nature have occurred before.
Right.
Increasing temperatures have occurred, higher temperatures have occurred before. You've
Right.
talked about this before, but
Right.
just recap for the audience,
So
because I
there's-
think that's really important.
There's
point.
4 bases for the theory of dangerous global warming. The first is the greenhouse effect. Sunlight enters our atmosphere. What isn't reflected by clouds is absorbed by the surface of the Earth. The Earth, like any warm body, gives off lower energy infrared radiation. Almost all of that, as it heads out to outer space, is trapped first by greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. It causes molecules to radiate, and those gases then re-radiate that energy, and that does tend to warm the surface of the Earth. So there is a greenhouse effect. The second is rising atmospheric carbon dioxide levels, the second basis. Scientists first measured those levels in the 1950s. At that point, they measured about 315 parts per million. And today, they measure about 400 or 420 parts per million. So there's been a rise. Mm-hmm. And the proponents of the theory of man-made warming say that is due to our industries putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. It's enhancing the greenhouse effect, and it's causing dangerous warming. The third basis is rising global surface temperatures. But those temperatures haven't risen very much. I was on a phone call with a couple girl students from UCLA a while back, and at telephone interview, I started asking them questions. I said, well, how much do you think temperatures have risen? Oh, 5 degrees. The answer is 1 degree Celsius in 140 years. About 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. That's all global temperatures have risen. And as we've discussed before, there were at least 4 long periods in the last 10,000 years when it was naturally warmer than it is today. And that's when there were no emissions from our society. I mean, effectively zero. And then the fourth basis for the theory is computer model projections. Climate models are run on supercomputers, and they project a much faster rise. A rise of 3 degrees Celsius or 5.4 degrees Fahrenheit by the year 2100. And then from all of those, from that temperature rise, we're supposed to be experiencing melting ice caps, rising oceans, flooding coastal cities, stronger hurricanes and storms, droughts and floods, species extinction, and all sorts of other things. And there's a new one every day if you read the press. But when you really look at it, there really is not any empirical evidence for the theory of man-made warming versus natural factors. Some things people don't know. The first is that our dominant greenhouse gas is not carbon dioxide. It's not water vapor. I always ask audiences this, and some of them now get, it's not methane. Not carbon dioxide, not methane. The answer is water vapor is Earth's dominant greenhouse gas. Somewhere between 70 and 95% of Earth's greenhouse effect is caused by water vapor and clouds. And that's what's blamed on for dangerous global warming. So if we say, okay, 3/4 of the greenhouse effect is due to water vapor and clouds, then the last quarter is mostly caused by carbon dioxide. But then we got to say of that last quarter, how much is natural versus how much comes from our industry? Because we have carbon dioxide everywhere.
Absolutely.
The oceans have 50 times as much carbon dioxide as the atmosphere, and the oceans are always naturally releasing it and absorbing it. When plants die, they release CO2. When they grow, they absorb it. It turns out that every day, nature puts 20 times as much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere as all of our industries and removes about the same amount. So what we're doing is really we're trying to mess with this very, very small part of things, and we're spending billions and trillions of dollars to do it, and trying to change our homes, our businesses, our travel, and everything else. And it's unlikely we're ever going to see an effect of all this, except the real economic effects to people and businesses and states.
Well, I mean, the economic effects have been devastating. So you look now at Europe, which is having to turn to coal in the wake of not receiving natural gas from Russia, in the wake of having shut down their nuclear power plants, and now having to actually provide for energy. They're starting to restart their coal plants that they had previously shut down. because it's still the concentrated power that they receive is well worth them not instead having industries and homes without heat and energy to make things.
I tend not to be alarmist, but more and more I'm thinking we're ready for a real disaster in Europe.
Oh, tell me about that.
Well, natural gas price, this is a Netherlands hub, has typically run about 15 to 20 euros per megawatt hour is how they measure it. That's what it ran in 2019, 2021, 15 to 20 euros per megawatt hour. Last year, the wind didn't blow in Germany and England and France, and so output from wind turbines, and they have all these wind turbines, was down about 40%. So they burned gas all summer. When they got to the fall, they had no reserves. And so the price of natural gas went from 15 to 20 up to about 80 euros per megawatt hour, went up by a factor of 5. That was before the Ukraine invasion. Then in March, we have the Ukraine invasion. And Europe imports about 30 or 40% of its gas from Russia. Russia is now cutting that off, or Europe is cutting it off. And so the price, I just checked this morning, was 170 euros per megawatt hour.
What?
It was 15 to 20 2 years ago. Now it's 170. It's up more than a factor of 10. So what's likely to happen is they think a quarter of people, 83% of the people in England use natural gas in their homes. They think about a quarter of those won't be able to pay their bill because the bill's going to be up by a factor of 3 at least, which means that gas companies are going to fail. They're not going to get paid for what they're doing, and the government may have to step in and nationalize those. It's even worse in industry. A union leader in Germany the other day talked about whole industries just being wiped out. The glass industry that uses ovens powered by natural gas can't make a profit. The ammonia industry that produces fertilizer can't make a profit. Petrochemical industry, they have all these industries that are seeing 10 times the price of a commodity that was about 15 or 20% of their costs, and nobody can run a business like that. So, I mean, Europe is the first taste of this idea that we can do without hydrocarbons, we can do things on wind and solar and hydrogen and biofuels, and people are going to pay the price. It really, I'm afraid to see what's going to happen in the next year.
How do we solve this?
How do we solve this?
This is
people need to get back to the stuff that really works. In the U.S., by the way, we have.
What do you know the U.S. comparable price?
Yeah,
if it's at 170 euros, what's the U.S. price right now?
Well, it's about 8 times the U.S. price. The U.S. price normally runs in a different metric at about $3 per million BTU. It went up to 9. It's down about $5.50 per million BTU. So it's up about 60% or so. A part of that is because we are.
Yeah, do you know in the state of Illinois, and I like to remind our listeners who mainly are Illinoisans, but the others do listen to this podcast. In Illinois, we are artificially capping emissions from natural gas plants. And so they're at about their limit right now for the year.
Yeah.
And so we have fully productive natural gas plants that are going to have to shut down unless Pritzker provides them some relief from regulatory, basically just blanket emissions that he put in place that are meaningless, honestly meaningless. And meanwhile, you've got people who need that natural gas.
I'll have to look into that. I was not aware of that. I know in Illinois we get 60% from nuclear right now of electricity.
That's really the Northeast section does, because they're part of the PJM market, and Ameren does not. Their mix is more coal and natural gas. 18%
coal and 14% gas. But there are other states that are in worse trouble here. I know Michigan is closing down a nuclear plant. They're also closing some of their gas plants. They're still at about 9% renewables, but it could go much, much higher. And we have a bunch of folks. The Mid-Continent System Operator, MISO, has said we got a shortage of capacity in the Midwest, and we may have rolling blackouts this year. And a lot of that is this shift to what I call unreliables, weather-dependent energy sources. It's worse in places like California, Oklahoma, where they have a lot of wind, and they have been shutting down the other plants. But so how do we get out of this? I think people are going to learn the hard way, and I think we're going to see a break on a lot of this. It's going to take a long, long time, though. because we still have the G7 all marching out there. They want to be green. They think it's the most important thing.
But meanwhile, China and India are actually doing the opposite.
Well, China is interesting. What they do is they produce wind and solar so they can ship it to everybody else.
That's right.
But they're still getting 65 or 70% of their electricity from coal, and they're they're building new coal plants. So is India, so is Indonesia, and many other places. So they're very smart in that regard.
Would we be smarter just to learn how to clean up coal? Or is coal already pretty clean?
Well, with the carbon dioxide, you really can't.
So again, it's like essentially educating people on the threat of CO2, it's really not as big of a threat compared to...
It isn't. So again, I just said that 1/20th of what goes in the atmosphere comes from our industry, CO2. But that's still a huge amount in human terms. I'm just putting a section in my book, and I got a picture of a coal train with about 100 cars. That's what a big coal plant in a single day burns all that coal, one day. And then what they do is, for every carbon atom in that coal, you take 2 oxygen atoms out of the atmosphere to produce CO2. So think of a volume of that coal train that's 2 or 3 times as big. That's how much carbon dioxide is exhausted every day from a big coal plant. Small in global terms, but it's very big in individual terms. And the idea that we can capture all that, eliminate it, and everything else is just kind of beyond common sense.
And perhaps not even necessary.
No, it isn't necessary. It's again great for plants. It's the great thing. We should be concentrating on real pollutants. We still have 80% of the world that is not treating water, discharging into lakes, rivers, and streams. That's a big, big problem. Many countries are just building their first water treatment plants. That's an area that we really ought to be putting money toward. Cleaning up of other pollution issues. Plastic in the oceans is somewhat overstated, but it still is an issue. It's more of a litter issue, if you will, than a pollution issue. But most of that, by the way, comes from Asia, and not much from the U.S. So banning your straws in Chicago is not going to have any measurable effect. But there are real problems we need to work on, and CO2 is not one of those. The good news is the world has actually been cooling for about the last 6 years, slightly, since 2016, according to satellite data at
Boy, don't tell Sean Caston.
University of Alabama, Huntsville. I'd love to debate Sean on this stuff.
I would too. I would love to see that. Maybe I'll set it up.
I'm happy to go to Wheaton. By the way, I've gone to Wheaton in the past, and
to Wheaton College?
Yeah, kind of challenged some of the speakers there that they've had.
That's great.
And they say, well, we don't want to be political. We accept the theory of man-made warming. We don't think the Lord's in control of the climate. People now are, but we don't want to be political, and so we don't want to have a debate. But I'd love to go talk to this. I have spoken at some classes there before for professors, but it's not the accepted view.
I just may work on that, Steve.
I'd be happy to work with you.
That would be great. No, I think part of the problem here is there's a real misperception. I mean, the good news is, and I love this because. I don't know if you read Holman Jenkins. He writes in the Wall Street Journal, and in fact, he writes a lot about climate. Now, he happens to all be in for a carbon tax, which I don't see the need for that. But so I differ with him on a few things. Yeah. But he did write this in his Climate Sanity Lost and Found. It's an editorial from the weekend edition, June 11, 12 of this year. He says... Michael Moore and Donald Trump can both be right about something. Climate politics devolves into a corporate welfare scam.
Well, it is. It's amazing. All of this is supported by, I don't know what corporate welfare scam, but it's certainly a government sort of thing. Corporate welfare scam. I'd have to see what he meant about that. Does he mean ESG and some of the other things that are going on?
Yeah, he's talking about ESGs. He's talking about all the the EV tax credits for Tesla, things like that. I mean, that's what he's talking about. He's talking about the wind and solar, the production tax credit, which is, unless you had the PTC in effect, you would never build another wind farm in the entire United States once the PTC goes fully away.
Huge amount of government subsidies. Matter of fact, state of Illinois right now, I think you could put in you can put in solar for free on your roof. Basically,
absolutely.
There's an Illinois credit. There's federal credits. There's all sorts of other things.
And it's shameful that they are actually going to cover really productive farmland in the midst of a potential food shortage with Chinese solar panels. That is their solution in the state of Illinois. It's just absolute nonsense. I cannot tell my audience enough about that. They need to hear that over and over again.
And it's probably likely that those panels don't break even over their lifetime as far as energy produced. There was a study done that looked at the solar installations in Switzerland and Germany. The name escapes me who the guys were, but they estimated, they did an analysis called energy received over energy, ERoEI, energy received over energy invested. And they found that solar panels in Germany and Switzerland were only 0.8%. So you got less than 1% of the total energy you put into it out over a 20-year lifetime. And so what we're doing is we're paying for all this energy to be invested in China to create these solar cells. They ship it over here, and you never get as much back as what it was paid to be invested.
To build the solar panel in the first place.
Yeah, the break-even's down about North South Carolina, where you finally break even, but up north in Illinois, you don't.
Well, my favorite quote from you, and I don't know if I always give you attribution because I use it all the time, but by the way, this is from Steve Gorham. Solar in Illinois is like growing a pineapple here. It just doesn't work.
Yeah, well, that actually came from a guy in Germany.
Okay.
What did he say? Solar in Germany is like growing pineapples in Alaska or something like that.
Okay.
It makes about as much sense.
It makes no sense whatever.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to conclude this interview. I mean, I could talk to you for hours, and we're definitely going to have you back on. But we appreciate the update, first of all, on the Supreme Court decision that says that the EPA very much overstepped their boundaries and regulating coal out of existence. Yeah. That is not something that's within their purview to do, and it needs to be returned to the legislature. But also, I just really appreciate your insight on this topic. Always, we're going to have you back on because energy is going to continue to be a hot topic. Yeah. It doesn't matter. I don't care if we're talking about it in the next 4 months or the next 4 years. Energy is the master resource. It powers our lives. It improves our livelihoods, and it's always going to be up for discussion. So you are always going to have a voice here and, of course, everywhere else. So, again, thank you to Steve Gorham for coming on to the program, The Real Story with Jeanne Ives.